we'd always like to see the value more highly. And Gary's right, Australian agriculture, Australian farmers receive the second lowest subsidised farmers in the world, and there's support mechanisms mainly into agriculture through, which has been drought support in the past, and R&D. They're sort of the two main mechanisms, but I think it's about 4% of total gross agricultural output is seen as government support, whereas countries like Japan is up around 50 and 60%, EU's very high, figure for the US was in the 20s. So very significant support, and we see today a story in the Weekly Times, America subsidising some milk into Japan market, I think, if I remember rightly. So we do need to continue to promote agriculture. We need to make sure that the barriers to farmers being competitive are removed. Long-term subsidies, I don't believe, work for any industry. You need, farmers and industries need to be able to be economically viable, but certainly there is support mechanisms when we have crises like we had in some parts of the state in the last couple of years, where government support to maintain the infrastructure that is necessary for agriculture to continue to provide for production, because as we know, you plant a fruit tree, that's 5 years before it's actually in production. So if you have a 1 year downturn and you see a loss of fruit trees, well, you don't turn them back on next year. And it's a bit the same with dairy cows. It takes time to build up a dairy herd, to build up a production system. So I think it's about how do we manage those peaks and troughs to maintain the productive capacity is really where we've got to focus.
Yeah, I mean, those are great points, and you're very right, cooking is a very important point to consider. So, there are multiple ways, and it really does create a bit of the issue of affordability and a fair price to farmers, and that is something that's a really difficult, complex conflict that we've got to work through. So how can we? I mean, as I just spoke before about the determinants of food security, you need the supply. But you've got to be able to access it. So to access it, we need planning involved. We need to make sure that where we do access our food, we've got public transport, for example, to get there. We've got financially, making sure that our Centrelink payments are adequate, because at the moment, when we do the modelling, it is very difficult to cover rent costs and energy costs and things. There's not much food left, not much money left over to purchase food. So we've got to look at those access also equations too. And then there's the culture, the demand for this food. And of course, we're up against billions of dollars of marketing spent on buying, in some cases, this very inexpensive food. And so when you're on a budget and you don't have a whole lot of money, and you might not even have proper storage, buying some processed food, and also it may be seen as a treat to children, might seem as the solution. But in fact, that's where the education comes in. That's where the cooking skills come in. And so we were happy to see that in the National Food Plan, our first ever Australian food plan, the national government taking note of that and in trying to offer some money to improve what they called food literacy, to understand where our food comes from, and to provide some extra resources around cooking.
A good question, and a good question to finish on. I think I just want to get final comments from each of the panel members. Our time has gone quickly, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, really, so we might need to look at some follow-up discussions about this. But as we finish today, if I could ask each of the panel to think about 2020 or 2030, not far away, what's sort of one immediate thing that you would like to see done, or perhaps comment about whether you're really optimistic that we are heading in the right direction? And we'll start at the top of the panel with you. Thanks, Kathy.
So I just spoke about the National Food Plan, and I mentioned it's a first food plan. What I'd love to see, and we talked about this earlier, is an integrated approach. At the moment, I'd say for the most part that food plan is an industry, economic, focused plan. You don't read much about health in there. You don't read much about sustainable agricultural practice. And so I'd love to see, and the challenge is, and we know it's difficult, but to work in an integrated manner so that we get multiple outcomes around health, around equity, around environment, and yes, around economics. But finding solutions that give us outcomes against all those objectives.
Thanks, Kathy. Graham.
I think the key to sustainability is actually economic success. Farmers treat their farms like their greatest passion in life generally, and as research shows, as soon as they've made a profit enough to cover their costs and perhaps buy a new ute every few years or a new vehicle, that they actually invest back in their land. We saw ABS come out with some statistics the other day. I think it's 60 or 70% of farmers actually conduct environmental works at their cost on their properties. Farmers are very environmental aware, but they need the funds to be able to do it. So it's about economic success. So economic success comes from being able to be competitive in the world market, because that's effectively where many of our farmers actually operate, not in the domestic market. R&D is crucially important. So we're going to have these challenges about community acceptance of new systems, and particularly to GMO. We've picked up a lot of the low-hanging fruit in production gains. So we've seen this massive leap in productivity from the 60s and 50s and 60s. It's actually slowed down over the last 5 years or 10 years. So where's the next leap forward in productivity and food production? If we're going to feed not just Australia's doubling Australia's food production, it's actually feeding a world population that's going to reach 9 billion people. To my mind, they're the challenges, and if it's economically successful, we'll have a successful and sustainable agricultural sector.
Thank you. Ron, let's assume that that fine government's still in power in 2020. What will have been achieved?
I like those comments about more research and more funding for research. Look, I think, and I agree with both previous speakers here, at the moment, a couple of points haven't come out, and rather than summarise, I'll make a couple of points. But at the moment, if you look at the dairy industry, and I'll look at that because I understand it a little bit, 60% of production actually comes off 20% of the farms. So there's some big farms out there, highly productive, who are responsible for 2/3 of the milk production that's coming out of Victoria. If you look at our grain industries, 80% of the grain that comes out of Victoria comes off 20% of the farms. So there's a few farmers down one end doing really well in a financial sense and producing lots of goods, and then there's a long tail of farmers that are struggling due to a range of reasons, including seasonal conditions, cost of capital, and a range of things like that. So the industry is continuing to reorganise itself and readjust itself. The other point I wish to make is that in April this year, the Planning Minister, Minister Guy, announced a permanent urban growth boundary around Melbourne to contain urban sprawl. He also announced that he's introducing a statewide agricultural protection overlays to protect high quality agricultural land. And my department and others are now working on, well, how do we define what's a high agricultural value land? We need to involve the cross-disciplinary issues such as water availability, transport, salinity, soil health, the whole range of things that we spoke about today. We're also seeing in regional Victoria regional growth plans being developed, and these will have one of their functions, a broad direction for land use, and one of those will be agriculture. So the community, governments at all levels are starting to think about how do we protect valuable land into the future for food production. So things are moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Ron. And from the environment perspective, final comments, Winston?
I just think that by 2020, if we can see the linkages more clearly, or if the community understand the linkages more clearly between the environment, their ethical and consumer choices, the impacts that their consumer choices have on the environment and other issues, so that they can make more educated choices about food. And then that also brings in issues like food labelling and so forth that allow them to do that. I think that will lead to a more sustainable Australian agriculture industry, because I think people, if they understand those linkages, will make choices to support that industry. And I also think it'll deal with issues like environment, because we do have reasonable environmental regulations in Australia, although they could be improved in some ways. I think one area where we've seen some important developments in terms of sustainability, environmental sustainability that relates to agriculture is water. We saw the Murray-Darling Basin Plan passed finally. That's now going to be implemented, hopefully, it should be pretty much up and working by 2019 or 2020. I think that, again, there's some scope for improvement as to environmentally sustainable use of water, but I think that Murray-Darling Basin Plan is a good positive step and quite an achievement for that to be coming into force now.
Thank you. And finally to you, Lisa.
I guess comments I might make just probably carry on from what Ron mentioned about the importance of the planning system, picking up not only food but also health as an integral part. All of the discussion I think that we've had today, a lot of it does come down to health, whether that's health and wellbeing or social health of communities. So, and all of those, I guess, impact on the risk factors to the rise of chronic disease that we're seeing. So the point which Tony made about rise of diabetes and heart disease and things like that. So hopefully if we can get access to healthy nutritious food more clearly and upfront in our planning systems, then we might see, I guess, a change in the vegetable and fruit consumption of the Victorian population, which is quite scarily low, at less than 10%, I guess, eat their recommended fruit and veg in Victoria. So
I noticed there's a big bowl of fruit out there here in Melbourne. I'm not sure about the other sites. Look, thank you very much, everyone, for participating today. And I'm sorry we couldn't get more questions in, but we're very lucky to have our panellists. So can I ask you to join me in thanking our panellists today? Cathy McConnell, Food Alliance Coordinator, Population Health Strategic Research Centre, Graham Ford, CEO of the Victorian Farmers Federation, Dr. Ron Prestige, Acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Environment and Primary Industries, Felicity Milner, Principal Solicitor with the Environment Defender's Office, and Lisa Kane, Active Living Officer with the Heart Foundation. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your participation.